Hi, I'm Ted Haftagaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
When you asked me to read the book, which was a while ago, I did so happily because I like and respect you so much as a friend. I didn't expect that I'd like the book as much as I do. It's wonderful. It's different. I read climate books all the time, and this is different. It's fresh. You're a money man. I didn't expect you to write a book like this. I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's actually, the truth is,
and it's funny.
I have a different perspective on the climate crisis than almost all the people who talk about the climate crisis. Because actually I am a full-time professional investor, and I've been studying this for, I guess at this point, somewhere around 17 or 18 years. And I look at it from an economic standpoint, some combination of politics and economics. And most people look at it from a scientific angle, an environmental angle. And I'm really talking not about the problem, I'm talking about what can we do about the problem, how can we solve the problem, and that's a different perspective.
Why did you become a climate person? When did that happen, and why?
So, Jane, you know that our family, Kat, is very much of an outdoors person, and her family's always been, and so's my family. And I went to Alaska in 1981 for a summer job because I wanted to see what North America looked like before Europeans showed up. I wanted to see the rawest, most basic form of mammals, fish, birds, fauna, just see original North America, and I loved it. And in 2006, Kat and I took our kids up there basically to see original North America, and what we saw was it's melting. And it was so obvious, and we were all completely stunned because, of course, we'd read about climate, but to see a massive melt, we came back home and sat around the kitchen table and were like, wow, what are we gonna do about this? Like, this has gotta have amazing ramifications. What do you think? How do you attack this problem? Like, why are we not dealing with this more aggressively as a society? And we all of us spent a long time trying to figure that question out.
And why did you decide to write this book now?
So I wrote this book because I think that the way that we as a society talk about energy and climate is based around a couple of ideas, both of which I think are false. So the first idea, which you can pick up particularly if you read the financial press, but it's kind of the subtext to a lot of energy thinking and climate thinking, is, look, we're an oil and gas country. We produce more oil and gas than any other country in the world. We always will. We can't get off it. And so all the talk about renewables and electric vehicles and all the things we're talking about is really just a bunch of, amateurish nonsense. Oil and gas is where the real world lives and is dependent on. And that's not true. That is absolutely not true. But we hear that. And the second thing that we hear all the time is we're destroying the natural world, and the statistics are in fact terrible, and we're in a doom loop. We're doing it, we can't stop ourselves, we're destroying the natural world and we can't stop, and so we're kind of screwed. And that's not true. And so I really wrote this book to say, could we please take a much more active and proactive attitude as Americans about how we solve this together, what it means to solve it together, that we can solve it together, and that in fact solving it is a challenge for sure, but it is also a great opportunity for a very divided society to remember that we can win things, we can take on and succeed in big challenges, and everybody loves being on a winning team. I played sports my whole life. When you're on a winning team, everyone on that team is your best friend. And if we do this together, we will reach across every division in our society, geographic, political, all the things that people think. And remember that Americans across all those divisions are really good people, they're really patriotic people, and they're smart. And we can do this together, and we'll remind ourselves what it feels like to be successful, accomplished Americans taking on big tasks and proving that we're the country that we set out to be however many hundreds of years ago.
Well, how are you so hopeful? One of the things that's unusual about the book is it fills you with hope. It made me feel very good. Tell me, what's the source of your hope?
So let me say, I mean, my job is investing. My partner, Katie Hall, and I set up a firm, different strategies to invest in companies that solve the climate crisis. So I spend all my time every day looking at companies that solve the climate crisis. And some of them are about deploying existing technologies, and some of them are about inventing new technologies. And what I can see is we are winning. You know, I called the book Cheaper, Faster, Better, because that's how we're going to win. And let me give you some examples of winning. So last year in 2023, globally, 86% of new electricity generation, so new power plants, were renewable. 86%. That is winning. And now, in some places, people really don't like to do that. And, you know, famously in Texas, the legislators have suggested and wanted to pass a lot of anti-renewable, a lot of anti-clean legislation, most of which they actually haven't passed. But, you know, verbally and all the ways, they're very hostile to this change. Let me say that Texas has tripled its solar in the last 3 years. It's supposed to go up another 35% this year. They do more wind energy by far than any other state in the United States. And they're not doing, you know, and my point is cheaper, faster, better. They're not doing it to be nice. They're doing it because it's cheaper. Like, people think fossil fuels are cheaper, and then we have these eggheads in universities who produce this very expensive solar and wind. Solar and wind are much cheaper. That's why Texas is doing them. That's why 86% around the world. People aren't doing that to be nice. They're doing it because it's a good deal. And so, and I'll give you one other example, which is, so one of my best friends, who I went to college with, who I went to business school with, who I was with last weekend, is from California. He's a car guy. Like, when I first met him at the age of 18, he took me out in his car to show me he could go over 100 miles an hour. And he has always driven very expensive European sports cars because he loves cars. And about 8 years ago, he bought a Tesla. And I was like, Matthew, seriously, are you suddenly trying to save the world on me here? He's a, you know, business Republican. He was like, I'm not trying to save the world. This car has amazing pickup. This car handles better than expensive European sports cars. And that's how we need to have cheaper, faster, better. And we're doing it. And my point is, if you look, you know, the cliche in climate investing is, we're not looking for a silver bullet. We're looking for silver buckshot. Like, we need a lot of things. And they've all got to be better. And we can go through all the different things, but we're seeing it. We're seeing a lot. You know, in the book, I talk a lot about young people doing amazing things in climate response. People inventing things, people inventing ideas, people doing things in new ways to make a difference. And a lot of this is generational, but it's amazing. If you read it, you kind of go like, oh, there's a bunch of really smart people tackling this. That's very reassuring. And I see that all the time. Really, really smart people solving these problems in ways that are surprising. And then once you understand them, you're like, well, I would have thought of that. Maybe.
Tom, can we talk about, where do you think we're at in terms of climate technology?
So let me, I don't want to be too boring about this, but I'm going to try and do it in the way that I think about it. So we basically have 6 big verticals that we have to solve. And they are electricity generation, so that's what people think about a lot. And where I can go into it, but I believe we're inevitably moving to much cleaner electricity generation around the world. The question is not, are we going to win the new generation? The question is, how fast are we going to replace the dirty stuff?
Right.
So that's one. Agriculture. Like, people don't think of food and agriculture as a huge issue about climate, but it's a gigantic issue. People use different estimates, but it's up to 25% of emissions. It's a very dispersed, obviously, all over the world thing. So there's so many new technologies coming in agriculture, and we could go about why it's hard to do that, but that's one. Manufacturing. Like, there are things that are hard to do, there are things that are easy to do. The hard to do things are called the hard to abate sectors. Making steel in an energy efficient, low emissions way is one of the things that people think is going to be hard. So there's manufacturing. There's buildings. How are we going to clean up all these buildings that exist in the United States? We do that. We buy dirty buildings and get them to net zero as part of our business. But figuring out the technologies for those, we are way far along in that. But it's complicated in terms of thinking about. And transportation is the fifth. And that is, of course, it's cars, and we tend to think about American cars, but this is global transportation, and it also includes ships, trucks, and planes. And lastly, the one that people don't always think about is about sucking carbon out of the air and sticking it in the ground or the ocean. And that's probably going to be at least a quarter of the solution. And so how we can do that in a cost-efficient way and scale it in a way that doesn't have its side effects that are rotten, that we don't anticipate, is a huge issue for the world. And how we pay for it, how we measure it. So there's 6 big verticals. In every one, I would say, there's clear line of sight to how we do it, but saying you're going to do it's sort of like saying, we have the team, therefore we won the game. You have to play the game. You have to build the technology, build the company, deploy it around the world and get it to happen. And so that is what, the reason I started this company is I felt like we won the argument. Now we actually have to go execute and make this happen real time, because the numbers from nature are worse than people understand, but the technology is also better than people understand. And we're in this race between deteriorating natural world and the solutions for that. And the question is, which one's going to move faster?
Mm-hmm. Seems to me that's one of the problems with nuclear. There's a lot of push now for what's called SMRs, small modular reactors, that are said to be faster to build, cheaper to build, easier to site, and so forth. And it hasn't proven so yet. How important is it that we get nuclear?
So from my standpoint, let me explain why people think nuclear is important, just to take a step back. Electricity, the cheapest electricity in the world by far is solar and wind. But as people like to point out in the fossil fuel industry, the sun doesn't always shine. Sometimes it's night. Who knew that? The wind doesn't always blow. So intermittent sources of energy. So utilities have to provide 24/7, 365 energy. You don't want the electricity to go out in the middle of the operating room with someone on the table. So they really want 24/7, 365. So you need baseload energy that's always there, and that's the argument for fossil fuels. Like, there's always a barrel of oil sitting in the basement, so we can always, fire up the generators. Nuclear is obviously baseload. It's there, and so that's why people argue that it's necessary, not that it's cheap, because it ain't cheap.
Or fast.
Or fast. And traditionally, the other problems with nuclear have been that it produces toxic waste that is toxic, really toxic, for 100,000 years. That's a long time. They don't have a strategy in the United States for what to do with the nuclear waste, because no one wants it. So all of the strategies in the United States have failed. The strategy is, don't move it, just leave it where it is, because we don't know what to do. The SMRs that Jane was referring to are supposed to be an answer to baseload non-emitting energy. The issue is it, and I'm on this, I'm just data driven. What's it gonna cost per kilowatt hour? Are we gonna produce toxic material for 100,000 years? And are we subject to an accident where something really bad could happen? And so regardless of how cheap it is, regardless of anything else, it's gonna be a horrible experience for everybody. People have been saying that this is doable for a long time in the United States. And so far, the data is, it doesn't ever come in at anything like expectation, and it is very expensive. So my attitude on this has been, I think there are other ways to get that base load, clean, non-emitting power that exist that we can do in size. So whereas other people think the only thing we can really do is nuclear, I feel like that's not true. You know, there are ways for us to get to solve that problem without going into all the hope for about nuclear that some people still dream about.
In the book, you write about your father's experiences during the Second World War, and explain what that has to do with climate.
May seem like a stretch. Well, here's what I would say. So I was born in 1957. My father and my two uncles were in World War II, which was not strange. Like in those days, if you were an American male, and I think American women also stepped up in a huge way, if we'll remember, in World War II, but for my father and uncles, you had to get into the war to keep your honor.
To keep your honor?
Yes, because everybody else was sacrificing, and if you didn't, then it was like, we used to go to northern Minnesota, to this lake in northern Minnesota, and I really observed, it was so obvious to me, everyone would go play, one person on the lake had a tennis court. So everyone in the lake would go over to their tennis court, and he would then decide who got to play, but everybody got to play, and it was like going to the town square. Everybody shows up, everybody's friends, everybody gets to play. But what they would always ask of the people in my father's generation, including my father, not what did you do for a job, not where did you go to college. They really didn't give a hoot. They wanted to know what you did in the war. And they were very judgmental about, did you show up in this time of trial? And that's my point about climate. This is going to be a joint effort society-wide, and everybody can contribute in different ways. You know, one of my very best friends of that generation couldn't get into a service, and he drove an ambulance in France because you didn't have to qualify to drive an ambulance in France, and he wanted to do something so that he went home, people wouldn't scorn him. And I think when I've talked to my African-American friends in the civil rights movement, what they said to me when I was in college, so in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, early 80s, they said when they'd go home from school, people would go like, so what are you doing? And they weren't asking, what are you majoring in? They're asking, what are you doing in the struggle? Like, are you showing up for us? And that's how I feel about this. Like, this is a society-wide thing. Everybody can contribute in completely different ways, and we can talk about what that looks like. But honestly, we're not going to do this with 12 people on Wall Street or 12 senators or any little group of people getting together in a room. We have to decide as a group of people broadly in the country and around the world that we are going to solve this problem, that we have to solve it, but that solving it is going to be really good for us. That is going to have, and that's where I'm coming from.
You know, you've said altogether a lot. One of the tragedies of what's happening, I think, is it's a collective crisis that requires, as you just said, a collective solution at a time when the word collective has been made a dirty word. Collective, the public sphere, ever since Reagan and the English woman there that Meryl Streep played her in a movie, Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. She said there is no such thing as society, right? So it's a challenge because people aren't used to being together so much. You know, I was born in the late 30s, and there was much more sense of the victory gardens and people belonging to clubs and people selling war bonds, and there was just more sense of the common good than there is now.
Well, I mean, for what it's worth, I spent probably 3 or 4 years traveling around the United States speaking to people for a variety of reasons, but really around the country and in red states and blue states. And I will say, my takeaway was amazing privilege for Tom Steyer, first of all. Let me say, I thought my daughter did it in New Hampshire, and I said, Ev, what do you think about it? And she said, biggest privilege of my life. Every day at the door, someone would say something to me that they would not say to their best friend and maybe not to their family. Every day someone would cry and I would cry with them. So my impression of Americans is really positive. That normal Americans are really good people. And that is, we disagree, and that is fine. In a democracy, we have an absolute right to disagree, and as I like to say, we are a loud and vulgar people, thank God. It's fine to disagree. I mean, that doesn't bug me in the least. I believe that Americans are overwhelmingly patriotic and good people. I do believe that we are separated and that people try to separate us for their own purposes. And we're seeing that politically, and we're seeing it in Wall Street, and we see it across, all kinds of elite institutions that work for themselves and often against the good of the American people, in my opinion. But I really trust the American people, and that story about Texas with them doing solar and wind is really a statement of, we're going to do this. We are practical, we are smart, those guys really know energy. I think I really hope that we can come together on this and remember how smart and tough the people in Texas are, and they can remember how patriotic and hardworking the people in California are. That's really, if we get there, we will just knock the cover off this ball, honest to gosh.
Just want to say something about Texas, okay? I'm making a documentary with Greenpeace in Texas and Louisiana showing the toll that oil and gas, fracked gas, is taking on the people there.
Terrible.
And, visiting Cancer Alley in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast like Corpus Christi and Fort Arthur and everything in Texas, where people are really suffering. And you see these terminals that they look like if you approach Manhattan at night. That's how, they're huge. They
and there's no
overpower.
life. There's no natural life. There's no birds. There's no animals. Port Arthur, Texas looks like the moon.
Yeah. And then in the distance behind the terminal, you'll see a whole field of wind turbines. How ironic. How amazing, until you find out that the electricity being generated by those wind turbines is all going to keep the terminal working. It's not for the people that live there. It's just that, we all read about the storms that happen in Texas, and they all lose their power, and the transmission goes down and everything. Those wind turbines are to keep them running, yeah.
Well,
Just wanted to say.
Well,
so
let's talk about that for a sec. So one of the things that's true is that there is a big push in the United States. We're the biggest oil and gas producers in the world. Natural gas is a local market. I don't know if you guys know that, but like in oil costs the same amount all over the world, plus the cost of transportation. So oil costs the same in Japan as it does in the United States, as it does in Europe, except for transportation costs and how powerful the oil is, how much, impact it has. Natural gas has been traditionally a local market because you can't transport it. But they've developed ways to turn it into liquid, and they're building terminals so that they can take American gas and send it to Europe and send it to the Far East. So just to put it in perspective, American gas has been at $2 a 1,000 cubic feet when it's been $24 in Europe. Like, that's not the same market. But we're talking about exporting our gas, and we're huge gas producers because of our technology, to Europe and the Far East. We are talking about exporting more energy to Europe and more emissions to Europe than all of the emissions in Europe. So when Jane is talking about Cancer Alley, when she's talking about South Texas, when she's talking about Port Arthur, there is a change going on where we're trying to vastly increase, I think it's 3x, the amount of natural gas that we export to the rest of the world, because obviously 24 is higher than 2. But as a result, we're really talking about a huge jump in emissions, and that is, what we're talking about. Why would we do that?
Yeah.
Why
And
is
why
that
do you
a
call it
smart
natural
idea?
gas? It's
Because
methane.
I'm dumb. Yeah, I agree. Natural gas sounds like, whoa, it seems
Tell them
really
about methane.
natural.
What is it?
It is methane.
It's far worse, right, than carbon dioxide.
Right.
80% more dangerous to us and to the climate over a short 20-year period. Well, we don't have 20 years to be playing around, right?
Look, my thesis on this is we have to make an amazing amount of progress by 2030. That's been the math. And every year that we don't make progress, the hill gets a little higher and we get a little closer to the end. Tougher to do.
So, and there's so much disinformation around climate, obviously, the way there was around tobacco, only it matters more when it comes to climate, because climate doesn't just affect people who smoke. Secondhand climate, I don't know, but climate is a global. But how do you handle, what do we do about all the disinformation?
Well, to be fair, Jane, that's why I wrote the friggin' book.
Okay.
Was like, there is a ton of misinformation out there. And my goal was to actually believe, I'm not trying to write a book that people might not mind reading. It's hard to read climate books because they're so depressing. And it's like, it is true that it's a big challenge, but it's also true that we're up to it. And I wanted to write a book so that people who feel hopeless, who feel helpless, can feel like, no, I have some agency, we can do this, and in fact, individual efforts count, but really it's coming together and working together to make this really happen. And I wrote the book so people could read it and think, okay, why don't we just go do this? Like, this is not beyond us by any stretch of the imagination. This is what America was built to do.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so important to ditch the footprint guilt issue?
So one of the things that I say in there is that, oil companies actually came up with this idea, which is measuring people's footprints, what you actually, the emissions associated with your life. Let me say that I have done my footprint, and I do all the things that I hope you're hoping that I will do, like drive an EV and put solar on the roof and never fly in a private plane. And I think Kat Taylor gets the credit for it, but we have a regenerative ranch where we're hoping that in fact we're really having a positive impact on sequestration. But the oil companies did it as a way of saying that the people who are leading the climate fight are a bunch of hypocrites, you should never listen to them. So that John Kerry is not really a good guy because he flies in private planes, so he's a phony and a hypocrite. Al Gore's a phony hypocrite. Look, we need societal change. We are not going to get perfect people. And so the whole point about a footprint implies that if we were just better people, it's not the oil company's fault. If we were better people, this problem would get solved. And therefore, if you're not perfect, you're part of the problem. That is not true. The truth is we should be careful about what we do, but the only way we're going to solve this is from a society-wide basis. And that implies, of course, caring about yourself, but also where you vote. We need to determine that this is a critical issue and that we're just not going to vote for people who are not going to help solve it. We need that.
Talk more about voting.
Let me ask you guys a question. Do you think Jane cares about voting?
Why is it important?
Look, here's what I'll say. Everybody in this country knows we're right. You can go to Republicans and ask them, is this a problem? Is it man-caused? And should the government be having a positive, a major response? And they'll all, not every, but depending on how you ask it, of registered Republicans, 57 to 75% of them will say yes to all three of those questions. They don't need to be convinced. Out of 20 issues, it's their 19th most important issue. It's not urgent to them. So when we think about voting, if you think about a politician, politicians don't care about polls. Politicians care about votes. If it's not a voting issue, it doesn't matter. So just the example I would use for all of us as Americans is, why is it that 90% of Americans want gun control and we don't have gun control? I mean, that's impossible, right? No. 90% of Americans want gun control, but they don't vote on gun control. 10% of Americans don't want gun control and they vote on it. 10 is more than 90. And that's the point about climate, is we need people to think not just that it's right, but that it's urgent and that it matters. And if you don't vote for it, you are gone in my book.
How do you vote for it?
You have to take a look. I mean, it isn't that tough to figure out where people's stances are on this. I mean, the easiest things to do, you can look at their LCV scores, you can look at what they said, but by and large, the people who are against it are proud of it. You know, they are, to use an expression, bowling for dollars. They are out there competing to get support. I mean, listen to what Trump goes to the oil and gas leaders and says, I want $1 billion and you can write the regs. Bowling for dollars. And so what we need is people who say, if you do that, there is no chance in hell I'm going to vote for you. The vote is what counts. And a lot of this is generational, just so you know. I mean, I did start a youth registration, engagement, and turnout organization, which I do think is the biggest in the US. But it's because young people...
It's called Next Gen.
It is, Next Gen. But the idea is young people vote at half the rate of other Americans. Most diverse generation in American history, by far. Most progressive generation in America. If we get fair representation throughout democracy, including young people's votes, changes everything. That is the swing group. And of course that correlates with the other ways that we split up the electorate. You know, we love to split up the electorate by, you know, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, all this stuff. Okay, age. Young people, the generations think differently. They care differently about climate in a big way. They vote differently. This is an issue which, if you look at 2020, just to put this in one story, in 2020, Joe Biden had a minus 21% approval rating with voters between the age of 18 and 30 in May of 2020. He talked about climate. In every single speech he talked about climate. It's the only thing he changed. He did not change one other thing. In October, he was plus 23 with people between the ages of 18 and 30. No other age group changed by more than 1%. No one changed. The only thing that changed was young people changed and they turned out. So when you look at 2020 and people are like, what happened? It's like, period, youth turnout. That is the swing vote in American elections. That will be the swing vote in 2024. And so, you know, that is the people who we need to continue to believe that climate is a health issue, it's an economic issue, it's a safety issue, it's a justice issue. This is something that actually hits people. I mean, it definitely hits me, but where people feel like this is my identity of trying to, what I care about, what counts, what I'm willing to stand up for.
You know what I want to... One of the things that I love is that you talk about people, climate people, and you tell stories about individual people. I love that, and I love some of those people. Choose one to tell the audience about that particularly touched you.
So let me say that I do talk about a bunch of people who are doing tech, and I love people who come up with cool ideas and ways to do cement differently and ways to change transmission lines and all the cool things that people are figuring out in labs and companies around the world. But the person who I think best represents what I'm talking about and really pulls it into one thing is a person who's a good friend of Kat's and a good friend of mine named Harold Mitchell, who is from Orangeburg, South Carolina, who lived in a place where there were a bunch of extremely toxic plants next to his house and in his neighborhood. his whole family. Harold is a very, very funny, smart guy, with emphasis on funny. He's really an entertaining person to be around. But his family got poisoned, his parents died. And he basically built a whole, it's called the Regenesis Project, and it was a way of renewing the economics of the neighborhood he grew in, but also renewing the health. It was a whole way of reimagining society in Orangeburg, South Carolina, including jobs, including healthcare, including the environment, and including justice. And that to me is like the package. Like, yes, it's about the technologies that he's brought in. Yes, it's about cleaning up the toxicity, but it's also very much about creating new things and justice, because he's in a, if you look around the United States, we've stuck all the dirty plants, and we've stuck all the highways, and we've stuck all the oil derricks next to the people who couldn't prevent it. And in the places where people, it's really cheap to live right next to a coal plant. It also takes years off your life, but it's really cheap. And so therefore, and Harold was really, in my mind, reimagining how we fight back against that, and continues to. And that to me is like, that's the struggle. This is a human struggle. This is about human suffering. It's about avoiding human suffering, creating something amazing together, and really being imaginative. And honestly, it's not a fluke that he's a really fun guy to be with. I mean, the first time I was with him, we were walking into a stadium with this marching band from his HBCU, and it was so fun. It was one of those things like, this is just fun. And that's kind of the point of this.
So I want to know if I have to curtail my fun for the sake of the climate. I love cheeseburgers. Okay. Do I have to stop eating cheeseburgers to save the climate?
So let me say this, and I am not certainly the expert, so I'm going to be parroting people like Kat, who have studied this much more intensively than I have. But I will start by just saying there were tens of millions of bison on the Great Plains. There are, millions of ungulates walking around the earth, and no one ever thought they were destroying the planet until recently. It's really the way that we raise animals that is, from an emission standpoint, so bad. And so the two things I'd say is, one, we cannot afford, from the sort of food pyramid basis, for everyone on this planet to eat the way Americans have traditionally eaten, which is heavy on protein, heavy on, meat, heavy on animal protein, chicken, pork, fish. We just, it doesn't work. But from an emissions standpoint, I think, regenerative agriculture in this case is really about rotational grazing, and the way that animals are brought up so that if they actually live the way they live in nature, I think that in fact that raising cattle can be a way of sequestering, believe it or not, carbon. That in fact that is traditionally the way that animals have moved around the planet, has been a way that's actually been very healthy for the planet, because they've been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's the way that we do feedlots, it's the way that we do industrial ag that is very, very bad for emissions, very, very bad for health. It's hard to look at the United States and think that we have our food and ag under control, because obviously there's real health issues in it. But there's also issues about the health of the land, that that we're actually sucking the nutrients out of it. There's water issues about the ways we do it, and there are very big environmental and climate issues about the way we raise. But I don't think we have to end cheeseburgers. We just can't eat 3 cheeseburgers for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Okay, we'll move from cheeseburgers to cement. What does cement have to do with the climate crisis?
So, just so you know, and I know people hate statistics, but the one statistic you should know about cement is cement and concrete are 8% of emissions. It's a lot. And it's all over the world, that as we build the world, we build it with cement. And there's a lot of work trying to come up with something different from cement, but at the same time, so in terms of full disclosure, we invested in a company that basically, cement is soup. Think of it like making soup. And you'd think that cement, the soup would be the same everywhere in the world, and you put in a little salt and you put in a little pepper and you mix it up and you always get the same soup. That's not true, just to be clear. Cement is made with limestone. Limestone is different in different places, and the limestone here in the quarry may be different from the limestone here. And since people making cement don't know what the soup should look like, they put in more limestone than they need. And that actually is the part of the soup that causes the emissions. So what happened was, someone whose family has been in the cement and concrete business for 100 years in Germany, using sensors and machine learning and artificial intelligence, basically found a way to real-time measure the soup, so that in fact you could actually get exactly what you're looking for, and you could reduce the emissions from cement by 50%. By information. Now that's a nice thing, but nice doesn't really work in this world. What works in this world is cheaper, faster, better. Money. It also pays for itself in a matter of months. It's way cheaper to make the cement this way for the person making the cement. So it's a good deal. And it's important because you may say, well, yeah, it's good to make an investment and get a really good return on it, so people will do that. That's nice. And people do that. But the other thing that's true is this: the developers and builders who are building things bid on contracts. So let's say Jane and I are bidding on the same contract, and she is using this information technology real time. That means her cement is going to be a lot cheaper for her to make, which means she's going to win every bid. So in a competitive world, if there's a dramatic way to change your costs, it's not like it's a nice thing to do. You have to do that, or you will lose every bid. So when we look at this, one of the takeaways for me is, why is this an important thing? Information, I believe that information measurement is going to be maybe the critical part of solving the climate crisis. And that in addition, many of the things we need to do, and think about it from a California standpoint, we're going to have to use the existing footprint. Like, we're not going to rebuild everything in the world in order to solve this problem. We can't do it. We can't rebuild every building. We can't tear down buildings and build them back up. And we're not going to tear down every cement factory in the world either. We're going to have to do an awful lot of this within the existing footprint that was built for different purposes. Mm-hmm. So the fact that it's flexible, that it's adaptable, that you can put it into the existing footprint, and that it's a really good deal for the people buying it is why this is important. Who knew? Cement.
What would you like people to take away from this book? And I hope you all will get this book and read it. It's really worth it. What do you want them to take away?
Look, my whole goal in this is for people to feel positive. I mean, we all tried to make this a book that people would enjoy reading, that they would think, this is not eat your gruel, but this is fun. And I want people to think, I want people to feel agency, to feel like we can do this, and that it's a meaningful thing for us in our lives. Look, as much as World War II was a horrible thing for people, and I think I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed, but it paled next to I think 30 million Russians died in World War II. I mean, it was a horrible, horrible, horrible experience in many ways. But for people who participated in, that may have been the most meaningful thing other than their families that they did in their whole lives. And I think that collective action to solve real problems where people, take agency and work together and accept each other and succeed is a really, really important part of life. And I think that in America, that's what, if you look back, we've tried to, we've made so many mistakes. We started with so many deep, deep, deep mistakes, but we've tried to solve problems and we've tried to do it together, and this is a great chance for us. We cannot solve this in America. This is a global problem. We're 11% of emissions. If we went to zero, it doesn't solve it. But what we can do in terms of our capabilities and how we can work with other countries, we can have, just as we did in World War II, an amazing impact beyond our shores, an amazing impact for ourselves in a really good way. And I want people to feel like that is a challenge that we can accept and that we can win, and that can make us different people, and that can be a real solution to not just the climate crisis, but to the way we see ourselves and get back to a much more positive sense of the kind of people who solve things instead of fighting each other. And so in a million ways, I think this is a great opportunity for us, and I want people to see it that way. Like, yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a real opportunity for us to reinvent ourselves, and that's what I want people to feel like. That is going to be a really valuable, great thing for all of us to do.
So I think we have time for questions.
First one comes from Jeffrey, who says, I think it's safe to assume that most people in this theater tonight believe climate change is an emergency and taking action is necessary. But there is a populace out there that doesn't. I'm sure everyone here tonight has a friend or a relative that doesn't believe that climate change is happening or is an issue. What is an effective way to make inroads to opening some of these eyes?
So getting away from the politics for 1 second, I mean, the title of the book is Cheaper, Better, Faster, How We'll Win, meaning you don't have to believe it, you just have to believe it's a good deal. And that's the point about Texas, that's the point about my friend driving a Tesla. It's like we have to win in the marketplace. We are not going to be able to appeal to people's good natures. The two things, and I'll talk outside the United States, there is a huge issue in climate between the global north and the global south. I'm sure a lot of you know this, so I don't mean to be lecturing about it, but basically almost all of the emissions have come from the global north, and the disproportionate amount of suffering is happening in the global south, and everybody knows it. And 86% of electricity generation globally being renewable. I promise you, the people in the global south know what's going on and know what has gone on and knows where the responsibility is, and the rule is the less you've done to cause the problem, the more you're going to suffer, okay? They know that too. If you look at last year, the people who suffered the most were in Pakistan. Pakistan had emitted 0.1% cumulatively of the emissions globally. 30 million people displaced. So, how are people going to do this? We need to come up with actual answers for people. We need to produce stuff that is going to make people are going to choose to do for their own personal, selfish reasons. That's what we need to do. And so, I know this is a public-private partnership. I could talk to you for a long time about how the public sector and the private sector can work together to scale this. I know there's a huge public role here. But I also know that in the end of the day, people are going to buy the cheapest, best product. And we have to have that. And having the cheapest, best product enables governments and elected officials to put in rules insisting on cleanness, because you can't say to people, I insist you put a solar panel on your roof that's going to cost you 4 times as much as what you've got now. People won't do it. But if we have solar power that's cheaper than anything else, then you enable a lot of rules and a lot of regulations that otherwise are punitive. They're no longer punitive. And so there is an interplay between public and private here, but the net is we have to be able to produce things that push forward people's lives, don't pull down people's lives. And that's, so that's the way we're going to win.
Alec asks, it seems at the end of the day, I feel the shift to renewables and clean energy on an individual basis is based on pricing and cost. When gas was high, there was a noticeable gain in electric and hybrid car sales, but when gas prices went down, people wanted their pickup trucks and SUVs. How do we do better selling the idea of clean energy independent of cost savings?
So let me make this point. I know most of us live in the United States. The United States is weird about cars, just so you know. We're really weird. Very few people in the world drive a gigantic pickup truck down to the mall to pick up an ice cream cone. Most of the cars in this world are much smaller. They are much lighter. They go much shorter distances. A lot of them have 3 wheels. A lot of people drive around this world on scooters. It's Americans who think they need, a 5,000-pound car to do grocery shopping. So if you look at where we're going, we really are going to, around the world, much faster than in the United States, we're going to lighter cars, smaller cars, electrically driven cars. And that is going to be, the way that we drive, if you look, as a friend of mine was lecturing me today, we don't make sedans in the US anymore. We make huge SUVs, we made huge pickups, and we make very small cars. And we don't really make very small cars. Other people make very small cars. And so when we think about the growth of EVs in the world, the United States is an anomaly, and I could go through the different numbers, but I think EV growth was something like in the 30% last year, and around the world it continues to be very robust. In the US it's sort of flattened out in the first quarter. But in terms of where we're going, people are making choices that are good for them. And if you look, BYD, this Chinese battery company, makes a $14,000 plug-in hybrid that goes 1,200 miles.
Oh my gosh.
That's a disruptive product. Where we're going is going to be much, much lighter cars. Maybe they're going to be plug-in hybrids for people who are really worried about about range anxiety. But we're going to go to a place where, in the world, there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to have a very different style of personal transportation.
Mm.
How can we, like George Shultz said, smash the oil and gas industry? How much of the transition is consumer choice as much as industry driven with government incentives?
So let me say I did run several propositions in the state of California with George because he was a Republican who also believed that we had to act on climate. I will also point out that George was on the board of Chevron. So I'm not sure he ever said we're going to smash the oil and gas industry. He said we're going to win on climate. What was the question?
How much of it was about personal choices versus government incentives?
So let's talk this is going to be personal choice, but let me say that the government incentives obviously dramatically impact personal choice. So let's talk about the biggest government incentive in the energy sector. So the world emits something like 42 gigatons of CO2 per year. So that's 42 billion tons of CO2. People measure it different ways, but just accept that's a number. The US government says that the social cost of 1 ton of CO2, for which people pay nothing to pollute, is $190 a ton. So if you do the math, it's about $8 trillion a year of a gift to the people who are emitting CO2. So when we think about how much of this is about personal choice and how much of it is about government incentives, obviously it's both, because the way that the government sets up the framework for energy, what people have to pay for, what they don't have to pay for, what they subsidize, what they don't subsidize, is really important. But by far the biggest subsidy in this place is the fact that people don't pay to pollute. And to be fair, no one ever thought they were polluting. You can't see CO2, you can't smell it, you can't touch it. No one knew this was an issue for the first, 140 years of oil and gas production. It was just energy was something that was great, and using more energy made people richer. And if you look at people's standard of living and use of energy, they kind of go like this. They're really, really highly correlated. But it turns out that in fact it is a huge cost. $190 a ton is the US government's estimate. And $8 trillion of subsidy is a lot of subsidy, you guys. That's a gigantic change. So to a very large extent, that's what we're dealing with, is that an industry that was actually really producing positive things for America and for people around the world had a cost that people didn't realize. And people hate, look, I'm sure that if the people in this room were being given $8 trillion a year and someone tried to take it away, they'd be like, that's just not fair. And we'd think of a million reasons why that's not just fair. But that's what's going on. And so in every one of these issues, there's no free market. Every market has rules. The rules are set by people. And I would say, in the old days, you could hire somebody who was 12 years old, pay him 25 cents for a 14-hour day, and it was legal, and we don't think that's legal anymore. And you can think of all the other things that were absolutely legal in this country that we now look at and go, that is horrible. So it changes. We change. This is something that's changing. But it's very hard for people who are making hundreds of billions of dollars of cash money to say, we're going to give that up willingly. That's not going to happen.
Can I say something about that?
I know you're going to, and you should.
If we could get President Biden to cancel the subsidies, that would be one of the most important things we could do to stop the climate crisis, because a lot of the drilling and fracking and mining becomes uneconomical for the companies if they're not getting the trillions of dollars in subsidies. There was a bill that was way better than the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. It was called the Build Back Better bill. I don't know if you remember that one. It wasn't entirely commensurate with what science says we have to have, but it came the closest. In that bill was a provision that ended the fossil fuel subsidies. And it was killed because of Democrats. And this isn't really, I think it's important to think about this. There was a guy in Texas named Representative Henry Cuellar, a moderate Democrat, and 3 or 4 other moderate Democrats persuaded Nancy Pelosi to remove that provision. These are all Democrats that take money from the fossil fuel industry, which most Democrats and Republicans do. And you've got to find out before you vote for them if they take money from the fossil fuel industry. Because if they do, they're not going to vote against their economic interests. She removed that. It didn't pass anyway. Henry Cuellar, a moderate Democrat, pro-fossil fuel, anti-choice. And when he ran for re-election, there was a young Hispanic woman, Jessica Cisneros, running against him. She was pro-climate. She would have kept the cut of the subsidies in. She's pro-choice, and the Democratic Party supported Cuellar. So it's what I mean when we talk about voting with climate in your heart. Pay attention to not just if they're a Democrat, but who are they serving? Are they serving their greed, their interests, their fossil fuel interests, or not? And we have to stop voting. The fossil fuel industry has a stranglehold on our government. I mean, the fact that these are people, the GOP and the MAGA folks, they criticize welfare. They criticize health insurance. They criticize the Obama health plan. They criticize, they hate socialism. But they're living off of these huge subsidies that we taxpayers give them. And anyway, I just wanted to. And one other thing, can I do this about the referendum?
You're going to,
okay.
And I want you to. Let's hear it for Jane Fonda. On all seriousness, good grief. How many decades are we going to count on Jane Fonda to come out and tell the truth, regardless of the consequences? How many decades do we have to count on her? Honestly.
Well, I'm almost dead, so you don't
No,
have to
she
deal
isn't.
with it too much longer.
That's not true.
But for decades we fought, and more importantly, the almost 3 million people in California that live next to an oil well have been fighting to get what are called setbacks, meaning a certain distance that oil companies can put their wells. They can't go within that distance. That's what a setback is, health and safety setback. Finally, Governor Newsom passed a bill, Senate Bill 1137, that created the largest setback in the country, 3,200 feet. It's the biggest one. We were, before then, the only state that produces oil that didn't have setbacks. Great celebrating. Fantastic, because people are really suffering, dying, nosebleeds, asthma. A week later, the oil companies started gathering signatures to overturn it. And they succeeded. They lied to people and succeeded in getting a ballot measure on in November that will overturn the setback bill that protects people who live near oil wells. Apparently, we have heard that they're going to spend about $200 million to win this. We don't know why. There's not that much oil left. And by the way, the oil that is left in California is really dangerous. It's more dangerous to the climate and to us than the tar sands oil from Canada, because literally all the easy-to-get stuff has been got. And so they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and it's nasty stuff. We don't know why they're fighting so hard for it. Maybe they just don't like to be told what to do. But just keep that in mind when you vote. Our side is called the Campaign for a Safe and Healthy California, and we have that bill on the ballot, and it's going to be what you need to vote for, because we don't want that to be overturned, and it all depends on how you vote and who you vote for in November.
Jane Pack.
Hi, Sarah.
Talk about Jane.
Well, yeah, after years of protesting and marching, and all of us, including Sarah and many other people in this room, Tom, Kat, and other people, have spent a lot of time trying to. Because I've gotten old, I will be in the middle of a sentence, forget what I was saying. I know what it was. So a lot of action, a lot of getting arrested, a lot of protesting, and we still have not gotten the legislation, the policies that are commensurate with what science is saying we have to do. And the reason is because of the influence of the fossil fuel industry. So we decided to start the Jane Fonda Climate Pack, which we are almost 3 years old now, and we've elected 71 climate champions all around the country. Last year we got, we focus on legislators, if you think, we focus down ballot. City council, state legislatures, mayors, controllers, county executives. You don't maybe think that's important. That's where all the real robust climate work is happening. And the Republicans 40, 50 years ago, they knew that that's what they had to do. They had the Koch brother money, and they took over legislatures and city councils, health departments, school districts, all over the country. And we've seen what's happened because of that. We have to take it back, and for the sake of the climate. So we focus down ballot with the Jane Pack, and we focus on legislatures that could be tipped. Last year it was the state of Virginia legislature. 13 out of our 14 Democratic candidates got elected to it. And anyway, that's where I'm focusing. I think we have to break the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry. And you've supported my PAC, so
Kat and I have supported Jane's PAC because Jane tends to be right. And she does the work. I will say, look, I live in NorCal, so I've never voted in Southern California. But I know that the Northern California ballot is almost more complicated than a PhD test. And I think for me, and what I recommend to other people, is find someone who does the work that you can trust, and trust them. Because I know that when I look at that ballot, there's a million things on there that maybe if I spent a week on, I could sort of get an answer to. But if you can find somebody who's really trustworthy and has done the work all up and down, I feel like that's actually what I try and do, because it's so complicated, and you get into these races and you have no idea the difference. All you know is DNR, and I think that's what I try and do. And one of the people who does that well is the League of Conservation Voters. They try hard. I mean, I'm sure there are other people, so I'm not saying they're the only people you can look at, but they are someone who tries to look at the climate aspects and the environmental aspects pretty hard, and do you can go to their voting guide and figure out where people stand.
Even Greenpeace now has a PAC, because everybody understands this is an existential election. I don't think we've ever been able to say that before. It's going to matter Whether there's a future or not depends on how we vote. But we also, have you heard about cathedral thinking?
No, what is cathedral thinking, Jane?
It's what we have to adopt. Cathedral, the people that built cathedrals, the ones that put in the foundations, they knew that they would never live long enough to see the spire finished. They'd never see the structure finished. But they knew that they were contributing to something that was going to matter to people's lives. That's kind of what, I'll be dead before the worst of the shit hits the fan, and maybe before we turn the corner, but I'm still going to fight with everything I have.
Well,
right?
a lot.
All of us need to.
So there was one of the guys who did a lot on this is a guy named Doug Tompkins who lived in NorCal, who built that huge, with his wife, that huge park down in Patagonia. In Chile and Argentina, it was originally supposed to be, I think, 3 million acres. I think it's like 16 million acres. And he'd built a couple of businesses beforehand, and he drowned down there in a big storm, kayaking in a big storm on a lake. And Kat and I went to his memorial service, and someone stood up along the lines of what Jane just said and said, if you can accomplish your life's purpose during your lifetime, think bigger. Because if you're really trying to do something amazing, there are people before you who have worked on that in important and serious ways, and you have to trust that there will be people after you who are going to work on it in important and serious ways. If you're trying to promote justice in the world, we're not getting justice during our lifetime all over the world, but people have worked on it for a long time, and people hopefully will work on it. And in terms of climate and preserving the natural world, we're not going to solve this problem during the lifetime of anyone in this room, but we can make a contribution and add on the things that people have done before us. And that is the point of where we are. But we are, as Jane said, we're at a really critical juncture on this. And so because of what we can do and because of what we must do, this is a time when I honestly feel like it's a huge opportunity for us to step up and have meaningful lives. And I don't think there's you can't be data-driven as an investor. You can't look at this and project the future and think that there's any choice not to do this, particularly since we can do it.
And we're the last generation that can do it.
Yeah. This is something where we could blow this. I don't think we will. But, we should know that, there are zombies in the woods.
Marla says, what would make your mom most proud of what you've done in your life? And Carl's question is, what would the single most important legacy you want to leave be? Like Rachel Carlson taking on Monsanto and Nader with GM.
Oh, no, this is you.
So, I am pretty sure that in our family, the thing that people respect is trying to do the right thing when it's risky. And I know that, I feel for a long time that I don't want America to get away from the idea that being brave is really important. That the people, when you think back of the people who've made a big difference, they've been willing to do something hard to do when they were at risk, and it was by no means clear that it was going to, in any way, shape, or form, be good for them. And, I would definitely say that the tradition in our family is you're definitely supposed to take a stand. And, from our standpoint, I definitely know that my mother was from that. My mother liked to fight. And she liked to fight big, mean people. And that is what she respected, and that's what she enjoyed. And I know that that's, I think that to the extent that we step up at risk against people who are powerful and strong, and I've always thought it's an amazing opportunity when you can be pretty sure you're in the right, because most things are gray. And it's hard to, I always say, God is not in the difference between a 28 and a 31% tax rate. But God might be in the preserving of the natural world, and I think that's the thing that I respect in people too. People do a hard, dangerous job with integrity and pride. And I think that's teachers, nurses, firefighters, lawyers, people who step up and do it day in, day out when it's hard. That's what I respect, and I think that's what our family respects.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jane.